Okay.
Dr. Jeffery is going to be talking today about his early experiences and life experiences as a criminologist and how he has come to think about the issues of crime prevention and the interaction between the brain and the environment in criminal behavior. So I guess we'll start with me, Dr. Jeff. Tell me, what was it about your early life experiences that got you interested in the field of criminology or the issues of crime in the first place?
Well, I suppose several. One, my father was first of all, a defense attorney, criminal defense attorney, and then he was a prosecuting attorney in Bannock County, where I was born, Pocatello, Idaho. And my uncle was head of the state police force in Idaho. So I came from a long line of law enforcement, lawyer-type people.
And so what did you get your undergraduate degree in, and what did you pursue?
My undergraduate degree was at Indiana University in economics and philosophy. And my graduate degree, I started out in economics and then shifted to sociology. Ed Sutherland was there, the big name in criminology, so I went out of Indiana sort of labeled, whether I liked it or not, a criminologist. Everywhere I went, people said, "You'll teach criminology."
And what year was that you studied under Sutherland?
Oh, about 1950, 51.
And what kind of things did he teach you? I mean, how did he get you thinking about crime?
Well, his was strictly a University of Chicago sociological approach, differential association, peer groups, Shaw and McKay, and that type of stuff. Big influence on me at that point was really two other people. One was Jerome Hall, who was a distinguished professor of law and jurisprudence, who kept raising the issue of criminologists, sociologists don't know what criminology is, and my doctoral dissertation was on that topic because I was very fascinated with Hall's approach, which I found out is now, was called the classical approach. And the other influence was B.F. Skinner, who was chairman of the psych department and just starting his big revolution in behaviorism before he went to Harvard. So I had three people. I had Sutherland and Soch and Hall in law and jurisprudence, and Skinner in behavioral psychology. So from the very beginning, I was always very interdisciplinary.
And so from Indiana, you went where then?
Well, I finished my dissertation. I was at Colby College in Maine, and I was Southern Illinois University, and then Arizona State University in Tempe. At that point, I became a real behaviorist because Arizona State was known as the Fort Skinner of the West. All the young psychologists who couldn't get jobs other places were there teaching behaviorism. So in that period of my life, I became very behavioral.
So tell me, your first article was on legal and sociological criminology. What was all that about? What were you thinking about?
That was, really there were three articles published in, I guess it was the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology, on the development of law over time, the development of criminal law, starting with the pre-legal period right on through the present kind of legal system. And that was published in the Pioneers series under the title of The Historic Development of Criminology. Probably the best known article I ever did. It's still being cited much more in other things.
And you eventually became cited in Mott's Delinquency and Drift. What was he citing you for there? Do you recall?
I do not. You're going to have to tell me that one.
It was that article. And I was curious if you knew what influences that article has brought. I mean, how is it?
That is interesting because I was going to go look that up. I remembered you mentioned it, and then I forgot to. In another article, Quinney credits me with starting the law and society, or law and social conflict theory. I think my big difference with Quinney and Dave Motz and those people is I took a strict legal historic view. I didn't make it a issue of ideology. It wasn't a conflict theory. It wasn't a Marxian-based theory.
Well, how did you move from looking at the emergence of criminal law to your interest in crime prevention and biology and the things that Diana has kind of carried the torch and done. How did you move? How did you get there?
Okay, I went to from Tempe. I went to Washington, D.C. for a 3-year project on rehabilitating delinquents using behavioral. I was the first, although you never read the literature, you'd never know it. But I was the first one to do a study of how you can condition delinquents. And it was a complete failure. And when I went back over the reason it failed, I said, well, Skinner's work is sound. I'm not going to question that. What happened to me? And I said, well, I was conditioning them in an environment where I controlled them from 9 to 5. 5 o'clock on, they left the project. They were out hustling women and drugs. They were committing all kinds of illegal acts. So in order to control behavior, I better start controlling the environment in which it occurs, which is a beautiful, basic Skinnerian principle. So I started to think about it. By that time, I had moved with the New York University with Mueller in the law school and in the School of Public Administration. And it happened that the School of Public Administration had a urban design section, a very well-known one. And I started to have coffee with the urban designers, and they started talking to me about Jane Jacobs and how urban environments determine what you do. So I said, all right, environmental design, crime prevention, why don't I write a book on it? This came out in '71. Same year I moved to Florida State. So I also at that time had somewhere in that period, I picked up the editorship of Criminology, an interdisciplinary journal. I was the founding editor. I was along with Mueller and Cy Dennett and some of those people. So at that point, I was into the environment. The first edition of Environmental Design is strictly environmental. The '77 edition brought in some biology and genetics, and it said the individual is part of this process as well.
Now, I remember you. We've known each other now for 17 or 18 years.
I'm not that old. You may be.
Well, I'm apparently older than you. I remember taking my first course with you.
You sat in the back of the room.
In the back of the room, never said a word.
Never said a word.
And I had, right prior to that semester, quit school because I was so fed up with the abstract concepts.
Would you like to name some names?
Absolutely not. I was just sort of, I suppose, disillusioned with the field, not getting anything concrete enough to really apply towards changing the world and having an impact on real people. Everything was sort of very theoretical and didn't really seem to have import to the real world. And when I sat in your class that semester, which was the semester I came back from having quit, it was as if I had found where I needed to go in the field, because your class was the first one for me that really gave it some context and some perspective and made sense. What was about 17, 18 years ago?
When I was just starting to get into the biology.
Into all of the biology, and there was a lot of contentiousness and a lot of controversy. And I would accompany you to American Society of Criminology meetings, and there would be controversy following you everywhere, sometimes ending in fights and very heated debates. Where were you at that time in your life with respect to this biology thing?
Okay, do you remember the year you were a junior? I remember you were a junior when...
Yes.
I'm trying to... What year were we?
Oh, goodness, that was toward the end of the 70s.
All right, in 77, 78. In 78, I was president of ASC in Dallas, where I was raked over the coals for being a new neo-Ambrosian.
Right. And wasn't Christensen there also? Was that the same conference where he was
No.
attacked? That was a different one.
He was a different one. But anyway, I was ridiculed from the floor while I was president, and I was very upset by the whole thing. And one of the people, I can't remember his name, he was a Swede, who got the Gluck-Selin Award for an outstanding European scholar. I remember making the comment from the podium, Sheldon Gluck's turning over in his grave now because he is so interdisciplinary and so interested in getting away from the confines of either law or sociology. So, I suppose I suppose the big turning point for me was 1973 when a book came out on the biological basis for learning. Up to that point, Skinner had been, an empty organism, the stimulus response. And Pavlov, of course, had been a physiologist and a biologist, and he talked very much about the unconditioned biological system. And I came back to that, looking at learning theory in terms of the brain, because that's what Martin Seligman was saying in his book, that all learning occurs in the brain and in the synapses and the changes in the neurotransmitters and so forth. So I started to delve very deeply into brain science from 73 on.
So it was really like learning a new field for you.
Yes, absolutely new field. I had very little biology as an undergraduate, and what I had I didn't remember, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Cut. Sorry, Jeff, you keep moving your chair back and forth, and that's really hard to capture, so...
Okay, you want to be still.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to go back. I'm sorry to do that. Can you re-ask that question again? You can cut this in post, that's why we're going to have to.
Okay.
Go ahead, and he'll tell you when. You re-ask that question again, and Jeff, stop rocking. No more of this, okay? This is fine.
No, you
Is he hitting his? Is this fine with the mic? He's doing. That's all fine. It's just the rocking.
Yeah, sounds fine, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be a pig, but
You are.
stop rocking.
So start from that last.
So your last question.
You gotta let me know
Wait, hang
what
on.
you're on. I mean, if you're on tight, let me know. If you're
Right.
going wide, let me know.
Okay.
So I can match that shot.
Right.
Okay.
No problem. Yeah, go whenever you're ready.
Okay. So you really had to learn a new field at that point, having come from a legal and economics background.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I'd learned two, really, psychology, first of all, learning theory, and then I started to move into biology, which I regarded as a natural part of psychology,
So
although in the
actually-
70s it wasn't regarded as, psychobiology developed after that.
Yeah. So it was sort of a natural progression.
That's
for
right,
you.
for me.
Because by the end of the 70s, you were teaching courses on biology. And you apparently had done an awful lot of reading, a lot of catching up in that field to be able to pull this together.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate
Yeah.
description of where I was.
Because you were really the first professor I had who left the empty organism concept behind, that blank slate that you hear about where the environment acts on the individual and the individual, goes off and behaves accordingly. But you provided this context that there are some individual propensities, some innate tendencies to behave in certain ways that the environment interacts with. So you had really learned that material in the middle of your career.
That's right, yes.
So at that point, criminology was still not quite on par with that, not really up to date with the research in that area. You had encouraged me to take courses in other departments, which I ended up doing.
Yeah. You
And-
came to me and asked, what can I do in
Where
a
can I go?
master's, doctor's degree? And I said, get out of criminology and take some experimental psych and psychobiology.
Right, and I have done so in other forums, and I'll do this again. I credit you with everything I've been able to do in the field and in other fields because of the background that you gave me. And it, like I said, it really pulled everything together and gave it a more, less abstract, less theoretical.
Well, it's always nice to have someone emerge out of this morass.
Well, I think
Very few students have ever.
No, there are more than you're aware of. There are more than you're aware of, and And in terms of incorporating these approaches into the field of criminology, you really were the father of this. That, you know, I think you're known in many circles as the father of something called biocriminology. And even though that's not entirely accurate.
Or at least the illegitimate son of Lombroso.
Legitimate or illegitimate?
Illegitimate.
Okay. So, knowing that you were going to be dealing with all of this controversy, how did you approach this over the past 20 years? How was this for you in trying to continue to incorporate it and bang it into people's heads that it was something that needed to be considered?
Well, I have found it very discouraging, very hard to put up with. And of course, the older I get, the harder it is to, especially when I read the daily murder rates that are going on and the number of juveniles who are ruining their lives by the justice system. I'm very discouraged by the whole thing. In fact, I find criminology at this point much behind where it was when I was a youngster.
Actually behind.
Because my day Sutherland was still alive and Reckless was there. He was coming in with his own ideas, and the Glukes were very much into this interdisciplinary approach, and it was an exciting field. But today I don't find, you know, I couldn't come up tell you what new ideas in criminology in the last 40 years.
Jeff, what do you think the consequences have been, not for the field, but for people in the streets, for youngsters, for adults in the criminal justice system? What impact
You mean the
neglect-
biocriminology?
What impact has the neglect for biocriminology had, in your opinion?
Well, neglect has meant that we just have more and more teenage violence. We're ignoring all the biological ramifications, the indicators. We can go right back to prenatal periods right on and trace why these people are what they are. And every time I read about a juvenile who's committed a horrible crime, you know, I cringe. And you always read this was a misfit, this kid was abused, this kid didn't have this or that. Now why don't we use a public health model and merge there and move in when the kid is 2, 3, 4 years of age? Why do we wait till 10 or 12?
So exactly how do you see, what would be the potential for these research findings to have an effect on prevention?
The way I have envisioned it is what I call a medical model, that is, going into a treatment prevention mode, much like the public health people do, epidemiological model, which would, look at the environment-organism interaction. Where are the diseases? How are they produced? What can we do to prevent them or treat them? If you tie that in with some of the longitudinal research, Wolfgang started in the 40s and it's still going on. Only 5 to 7% of these kids are going to go bad. Most of them are going to grow out of it. Or Robin's notion on drug addiction, that only 8 or 9% of the Vietnamese addicts are addicts when they return. There's something different about these people. And why don't we look at that?
The Vietnam vets,
right,
that were so pervasively addicted during the war, most of whom shunned it when they came back, leaving only those that were vulnerable.
Right, the vulnerability or invincibility kind of thing that some social workers now talk about. You take a family with all the problems in the world, one kid's going to emerge out of that. The rest are going under and one's going to emerge. This is fascinating to me, that this kind of... This is something that sociology and criminology have always ignored, individual differences. They talk about races, they talk about classes, they talk about gender. Look at, for example, one of the examples I used in a recent article is testosterone levels. There are females who have higher testosterone levels than some males. So why talk about female-male differences? Why not use individual differences? But that's just something that sociologists just have no concept of what an individual is.
So I suppose, in a sense, that the policy implications then would not focus on groups of people, as many sociologists would fear, but rather on individuals in need of help.
Right.
Now, you've been doing a lot of work in crime prevention through environmental design, and in fact, that's one of the many works that you're very well known for, your CPTED book, and all the things that have followed that, and the fact that there are a number of criminologists very involved in that whole CPTED concept now. How does that interact?
Okay,
with your work in biology?
let's go back to the whole CPTED concept, which started in '71. It has been pretty well lost in American criminology with one, Oscar Newman's work on defensible space. Newman was an architect but used social variables to explain what he found rather than remembering that he was an architect. And he got big money from the federal government, millions of dollars poured into crime prevention. It was called CPTED. It was my book, my title, but it had nothing to do with what I was doing. And that was followed by Clark's work on situational crime prevention and Felson's work on routine activities, which again had nothing to do with the crime prevention I was talking about. So, you know, I've often been confused or ignored or whatever the word is in this whole crime prevention area. There are no real good CPTED programs in existence, you know. They've been heavily financed, good research, so forth. People keep asking me, what research are you doing? And I said, I don't do research. I can't get funding. All I can do is go around and scream and holler.
And think up new ideas.
That's right.
So how different is CPTED from situational crime prevention of Ron Clark at Rutgers and Marcus Felson's routine activities? How different
Okay, it's quite different. CPTED, at least as I would envision it, and of course it was not spelled out in any great detail in the original book, and unfortunately the later papers have not been utilized the way they should be. It does not use individuals who have rational choice. It does not use free will. It talks about the physical environment, the important things of the physical environment. Pollution. For example, this book on our stolen future, which just came out, shows that everything from sperm cells to fetuses to genetic predispositions to attention deficits, all these things are being harmed by the pollutants, the pesticides, and so forth. This is the environment. This is the environment that's impacting on the brain. Now, I don't know how you get that into a situational crime prevention
So
model.
for you, it was quality of life aspects that affected individuals, and for Clark, for instance, it's having a rational offender who thinks about the situation and goes, this is an easily accessible target, or this is how he fits
Yeah.
Felson's work, and therefore I can do a crime here because it's a
Yeah.
suitable target and
Ron-
I pass as a suitable guardian.
Ron Clark's view is the old classical view of the utilitarians: punishment, pain, and pleasure. What he calls gain and loss. He uses economic terms rather than psychological terms. And if an offender is about to steal something, you make it hard for him to steal. You make punishment as a, you know, this isn't the way individuals react. I mean, look at all the people who commit murder and rape every day knowing that if they're caught, they're going to face something.
Well, you're an economist, though. I mean, he's using econometric models. He's thinking about terms using...
I'm an economist who gave it up. I don't believe in a rational man.
So for you, the offender is not the rational, thoughtful, let me think it through kind of person. He's the opportunist, or who is he?
No, he is the fellow who's living out his emotional life. His limbic system is taken over. To control that behavior, you have to have very clear neural pathways from the limbic system to the cortex, especially to the prefrontal lobes, where thought and rationality and these types of things occur. Now, if those neurons are not in their proper position, and I suddenly get an urge to rape or rob or commit murder, I will do it. You know, there's nothing rational about it.
So what about the influence of drugs and alcohol and other environmental that become biological factors when
Now
they're
this,
taken in.
I'm glad you asked that because this was the next point I was going to make. Most offenders, at least 70-80% of them, have drug alcohol related histories. Now these are neurochemicals that are matched by what goes on in the neurotransmitter system in the brain. They're altering the brain chemistry. They're pleasurable because of the pleasure centers of the brain. And, how in the world do you explain to routine activities the actions of a alcoholic or a cocaine addict? It just didn't make sense.
Well, isn't it the rational offender who wants the alcohol to feel better, to feel high, to feel good? I mean, I think it's rational to want to feel good. You said they're pleasurable.
So you mean he is being rational by
Taking the drug.
and he feels better?
Yeah, let's say.
No, but what he is doing, I suppose, is using the rational part of his brain to beef up the limbic system or the emotional part. Certainly when he's under the control of alcohol, he's not very rational. In fact, I don't think alcoholics drink because they think about it, any more than people smoke because they, think about what is nicotine. Of course, if you think about the harm that drugs do to the body, and you say people are rational, that's hard for me to put these two together. People are smoking, so 20 years later they can die of lung cancer, and this is rational behavior.
So how does this all fit? You had early work with the insanity defense. Does this fit anywhere in this big picture? What was that work that you did with the insanity defense?
When I went to Washington, D.C. to the Washington Institute of Psychiatry, my first position there before I started the education project was the insanity defense, the Durham case, which was a District of Columbia case saying that, it was based on mental illness, not right and wrong, not the Mcnaughton rule, but the ability to, understand what was going on and to some notion that you had to have a mental disease. Now this brought the psychiatrist in.
Now, is that the product test?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
No, the product test was the Mcnaughton test, the product
Okay.
of. This was a new rule that said if the defendant has a mental disease or a mental illness, I guess they called it mental disease or mental defect, I think was the language of the decision why you were not guilty. Well, of course, how does this fit into what I've been doing? I've been arguing that rather than having lawyers make decisions about behavior, we should have MDs do it. It's not an issue of whether the person is insane, because that is a legal concept. In the psychiatric literature, there is no such thing as insanity. There is no such thing as mental illness. And especially with the newer techniques of brain scans and blood tests and tests for serotonin levels and so forth, it makes great sense to say this person has a defect, biological defect. In fact, in one of my books on the insanity defense, I argued that the right and wrong test should be replaced with the biological test. One, is there a neurological, neurochemical defect? And two, can this then be related to the behavior that is involved in front of the court? You wouldn't sentence the individual to life imprisonment. You would say this individual needs therapy, no sentence, any more than you sentence a cancer patient to a hospital, You treat it strictly as a medical problem. Now, for some reason, and I think it's because we have this dualism of mind and body, that we think that certain behaviors, like if you have cancer, well, you couldn't help it. We feel sorry for you. If you go out and axe 3 people to death, oh God, what a horrible person. To me, they're in the same category. They're both caused by physical aspects of a mind or a brain-body interaction.
So what would you do then, considering public safety concerns? Would you divert an individual with a neurological defect out of the criminal justice system? And then how would we take into account public safety concerns if the individual was in fact dangerous?
He would be funneled into a psychiatric clinic or psychobiological clinic, neuropsychiatric, since psychiatry is pretty neurological
In
these
a
days.
secure facility?
And he would be kept there until such time as they could certify him as cured. Now, what happens today is individuals are found mentally ill, they're put in a hospital without treatment, and then released under the public where they're dangerous.
Well, it must make you crazy. Well, no, a lot of things do, but the laws in the United States, in many states, prohibit felony offenders from receiving drug abuse treatment. That must be something that particularly concerns.
And it's even more embarrassing, as you know and I know. I'm trying to do research. You cannot take a blood test. You go into for a medical exam, they routinely take blood. They take blood in prison for the typical testing for HIV and other diseases, but you cannot use that to determine some kind of, let's say, hormonal disbalance or low serotonin or what have you.
One principle that I've inherited from you that I repeatedly state, and I think you'll agree, is that we do not ask, and it's almost a direct quote from 15 years ago, we do not ask offenders if they want to be incarcerated, nor do we ask them if they want to be executed. But if we want to give them treatment that we know will reduce their recidivism and those precursors of their criminal behavior would be better treated, we have to ask for permission.
Yeah, it's one of the interesting things that happened in my career. A number of years ago, I made a statement in one of my classes, that we cannot treat them. Therefore, why don't we say we're going to stick a needle into them, and this is punishment. And one of our graduate students went out and on television told this story, took it seriously, that Jeffery was going to harm criminals by sticking needles into them.
Yes, these things aren't always well understood by the public, that's for sure. You make some of these points, and you have been for as long as I've known you, and they're still not well understood. And I don't think that many people in the field who know you professionally understand how humanitarian your concerns truly are, that you have no intentions of stigmatizing groups of people or medicating small children en masse in the inner city, but instead that you'd like a more rational approach to crime control, which is primary prevention, medication when indicated, that kind of thing.
Looking at the individual.
Looking at the individual.
One of the things that bothers me so much is the amount of violence that's around and the way we respond to violence with more violence. People are often, every day I hear about witnesses who want to go see the killer executed. Or they get very upset if the fellow gets a life sentence. I've often been asked the question, and my honest answer is, what if your daughter was murdered? Wouldn't you want the guy executed? No. I want him studied. I want to find out why he did it, because if we had taken that approach 30 years ago, my daughter would still be alive.
That's right. That's right. Ted Bundy actually asked to be studied. We had his consent, but we
No, we had to pry the guy. That's right.
And not be able to find the causes and eventually prevent them in others.
While we're on the Ted Bundy topic, I was a student of yours at the time, and I sat in your class.
No, I didn't do it. I told you at the time.
I sat in your class, and I remember thinking I need to throw away my aluminum cookware because my trace minerals were probably high, because my aluminum trace minerals and my magnesium, I was all concerned. I wanted to get a hair trace mineral done. And I remember thinking about the city and crime prevention and design and not really knowing where it all fit, but maybe you've already talked about that, maybe you'll touch back that on again. But I remember at the time in class you kept saying you really thought that Ted Bundy would have a brain abnormality, would have a brain tumor, would have something recognizable that upon autopsy would be detected. And as far as my recollection, there was nothing. And I never got
Nothing studied or nothing
There
discovered?
wasn't a brain tumor. There was brain there. There was not a brain tumor.
Where did you hear that?
I actually read that, I believe, in the papers, that they had actually did an autopsy of the brain and there was no brain abnormality.
There's no way though to autopsy a brain and find out how it's functioning
How it
or
functions at the time.
malfunctioning. All you can see is an anatomical defect, something gross like a tumor.
So did you feel wrong? Do you feel wrong that there was no tumor, or you would have done a PET scan? I mean, where are you with that? I always wondered.
The story I heard was that the results were never released because of the family. And but I can speak much more authoritatively on a Harvard University neurologist who did do a autopsy on the brain of the killer who went through Tallahassee and kidnapped a co-ed out of the Governor's Square Mall. I've forgotten his name. Australian fellow.
Mm-hmm.
And that story has never been released. See, even if we do these studies, we don't put them in the paper. We don't show pictures of them. So,
Why is that?
well, because there is a horrendous opposition to doing anything that shows the criminal is not guilty, that there is some innate causal mechanism at work. We still believe in free will. We still believe this is a mean-spirited bastard who is doing these things, and the only thing to do is to get rid of him.
Why do you think we have these feelings? Do you think that they're strictly vengeful, maybe coming from our own limbic system
Yes.
in society?
I have stated for years, and lawyers don't listen to me, that the whole legal system is nothing more than legalizing revenge. You start out with a legal system that says, go out and kill your brother's injurer or whoever. And we had the blood feud and the vendetta and all those things. And then the law came over. The state said, oh, you have to go before a judge. Only the judge can prosecute you. Only the state can prosecute. Only the state can convict and execute.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have the state doing it. And these poor victims are sitting there wishing that they could be the executioner, you know.
So the state has to do it in such a way, I suppose, that it produces a visceral reaction in the audience, so that
It satisfies the revenge need, and we dress it up in this legal jargon. You know, we go through the process. We go through the O.J. Simpson ritual and so forth and so on.
How can you see public policy changing as a result of this science, maybe 50 years from now, it's taking so long?
If you'd asked me that when I graduated, I would have said, "Oh, we're headed into the, you know, treatment reform. It's all there."
Mm-hmm.
I never in the world would have guessed, although I've been a very good predictor of where criminology is going, I never would have predicted that it would return to this revenge, punishment, build more prisons model. You know, what we are doing today is so insane. When the president has to say we need 100,000 more police on the streets, that's going to do something. And his opponent, who is in the Senate, Bob Dole, says from the steps of San Quentin, you know, we're going to really build a legal system. I don't. How foolish can you be? How many police do we need? How many prisons do we need? There was an article in the paper the other day that every small community in Florida is looking for a prison because it employs 1,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
It's
I
funny,
can't show much enthusiasm for the future of the system.
in psychology, normally a learning curve goes up. At some point it eventually plateaus, but it usually doesn't go back down. And I suppose, in your opinion, that learning curve has sort of taken a downswing in that we've punished and built prisons for decades and decades, only to have more crime and more violence, and we're not really learning much from
We're
that.
not.
So tell us, the young criminologists,
Well, you're young.
who are shaping the field, who are professors and researchers, tell us where the field should go. We know what your vision about it, where it probably will go. Tell us where it should go. What should we do?
Well, I would like to see a much more interdisciplinary approach. I think we need criminology for the simple reason that psychologists and biologists and lawyers and so forth do not know some of the issues that have to be raised within what is crime, what is criminal behavior. I would, for example, have at least one or two urban planners on my faculty. I'd have a couple of neuropsychiatrists, neuropsychologists. I would hopefully blend these with what else is going on in the field. I'm sort of lost, where would you use what's been used in the past? Where would differential association fit into this? I have argued for years that learning theory is biological. And sociologists to this day are still presenting programs, as in ASC 1996, about social theories of learning. There is no such thing. But yet we pretend there is. I would train all my students to think, through the learning theory type of thing, through the brain structure. And then when they get out with their PhDs, they can start putting some of this together. But short of that, I don't know where we're going. But even with that, I think the missing link is the political. Because politicians aren't listening now. If you go out and tell them, oh, we have a great project here, give us $5 million and a few years, and we will show you some very effective techniques for environmental design or for biological interventions. I've been trying that route for 20 years, and I know other people who have, and they're not making any headway.
Well, in the one area they are listening a bit, and this is something Diana was going to talk about, is to the constituents who are saying that there's a racist component to studying biological links to criminology. They seem to be listening to that. Why don't you guys talk about that?
Yeah, the whole issue that arose from that genetics conference, the Genetics and Crime Conference. Can you talk a little bit about how that idea originated to have that conference, what happened to it in terms of getting dismantled, and then once it was reinstated, what transpired?
Yeah, well, you're probably closer to it than I am because you worked on the original conference, and I did not. All I know is I heard that there was a conference scheduled, and then I heard that there were objections based on some of Peter Bragan's psychiatric opposition, that it's all racial to study these things. And then it was reinstated past year, again invaded by protesters who said that only people who want to deal harm to races will do that. My own answer is very simple. Most of the violence that occurs to blacks is with other blacks. The most dangerous person in the society in terms of being a victim is the black, for rape, for murder, robbery. And I don't see anything racial about trying to prevent these kinds of harms. Added to that is the fact that there is no such thing as a genetic system that falls out on racial lines. Without even assuming that we started out as individual races somewhere in the millions of years back, each of us is a combination of our own unique genes. And to say that this person differs from that person because of skin color. You know, if we're going to look at it scientifically, we have to look at the individual composition.
So you're saying that there's really no scientific basis for allegations that this research
No,
is racist?
absolutely not.
They're construed by people's impressions of
That's
opinions
right.
that they already have.
Well, I teach biology and crime, a couple lessons in my theory classes on biology and crime, and one of the concerns that my students raise, and this, I get this question every time, I don't know how it comes up, what if they were to find, for instance, that there is genetic components, let's say low serotonin levels, consistently raised in violent environments early on, they give that, you have the genetic susceptibility, and because of the low serotonin and because of the environment, it is brought out, as the gene is expressed. What if they find that something like that is correlated and related to, let's say, sickle cell anemia? And somehow the question always gets raised, and as we know, sickle cell anemia is a disease of the blood cells that predominates in African Americans and people of African descent.
Mm-hmm.
And my class just goes nuts for hours debating, like, what if it were related to something like sickle cell anemia? You'd be taking a category of folks, a racial category of folks, and saying, we found a genetic component, low serotonin, I'm just giving a hypothetical, that's within this a whole race of folks. I mean, what kind of implications does that have? I mean, I can see the racial tension there. I mean,
Yeah,
talk about
I
that.
suppose it's obvious, and especially if you go back to the fact that there's still a great deal of fear, legitimate fear of that type of exploitation of science. That isn't science, of course. That's the way the political system and public concern sees it. I would again, one of the examples I used at this Maryland conference was people do not object to studying sickle cell anemia. They do not object to studying heart disease, high blood pressure, all of which are very much concentrated in African American populations. So why do we handle these as medical health problems, and at the same time we can't handle violence or low serotonin levels or whatever as medical problems? Why do they suddenly become political problems?
Well, Jeff, do you have any other thoughts or comments or things that you'd like to talk about that we didn't ask you about?
Well, let me take a second here and
Okay.
see if we didn't. Boy, I think we hit a lot of it. I have nothing further.
Did you want Matt to come in here and
Yes,
interact a
could
little
you?
bit with you? I'm going to take out. Okay, you might need to do a sound check on you, but I better not roll.
Are you going to stay in the room?
Do you want Denny to be next, or do you want just? Do you want to make it like a make it like a new shot?
But in class, I wasn't a very talkative student, but I did try to absorb everything that you said. What I did absorb most was what we talked about when we went out for a beer after class. And these were the times I was able to ask you all my questions that would pile up during the course of the semester. A lot of your students would come to me and say, how do I get Jeff to talk to me? And I'd say, take him out for a beer. So let's pretend like we're out for a beer and I'm your student again asking you questions. Describe to me what you see as the biological mechanisms in the brain that are able to take in this environment. You had sort of this circle that you would draw on the board and describe the active organism.
All right, the brain-environment interaction, of course, starts with the sensory system. Everything that we know and experience has to go into the senses. And I spend a little time in class going through the visual and the auditory and so forth and so on. Once it hits the proper areas of the brain, like the visual area, the olfactory area, and so forth, why, it is then stored, sent to certain areas, and most important, I suppose, it starts to interact with the rational brain, the cortex, the prefrontal lobes. In fact, it goes from the sensory. In the cortex, there's a sensory area and a motor area, and then the action or the rational command area. So all of that is being stored, and of course depending on what you have experienced and how important it is, how it's related to the hippocampus and so forth. Certain memories are there and certain are not. All of these, of course, involve changes in the neurons and in the synapses. Now, when behavior occurs, you get the reverse process where the motor areas are activated based on all that's already in the brain, and signals are sent, electrical signals are sent to the muscles and glands, and what we call behavior then is primarily heavy structural skeletal muscles. We don't usually talk about a gland like the thyroid gland behaving, although I suppose some people do. So what we call behavior, like lifting your arm or putting a foot on the brake, let's take the example, you're driving a car, you come to a red light, you put your eye, receives that, the stimulus goes in to the brain, is sorted out, activates the muscles that then control the foot. Now this all occurs, of course, in a split second, hopefully, and it's, what becomes a simple stimulus response pattern for a Skinnerian now becomes a stimulus brain response pattern for the neuroscientists.
So events that take place in the environment are experienced by sensory systems in the brain, where they are then stored, compared with what's already there, and then some sort of motor reaction is elicited through this process to react,
Right.
in some sense, to what the environment has put into the brain. What happens when this process goes awry and people misbehave, so to speak?
I suppose some of the best examples coming out of biological criminology is an overload in the limbic system. That is too much activity, or the reverse, which often happens. You have too little excitement, too little autonomic response, and therefore you're out trying to bring in stimulation, so you're acting out to get this system geared up because it's under-aroused, the under-aroused autonomic nervous system theory. Or you can run into the situation where you have prefrontal lobe damage, where the ability to process and respond to these basic emotional drives has been damaged in some way. Mm-hmm. Because in the prefrontal cortex, you get what people usually refer to as rational thought or choice, deliberation, planning, these types of things. Now, if that isn't available, you're not going to be controlling your emotional life. So I see it basically as a link between the emotional centers of the brain and the rational centers, which is all very neurological and biochemical.
And so if for some reason it's not well balanced, behavior will not be
That's
either.
right.
It's interesting that your theories and understanding of human behavior are very well understood in other fields outside of criminology and widely studied throughout physiological psychology and the neurosciences and so
Correct.
forth, and are basically fairly foreign to many of those in criminology.
Okay, is that what we want to cut it? Great. Okay, do we want to start with you now? Or?
Now let's go to Matt.
Okay, great. Do you want to step out, or how did we want to do this? They just finished their interview.
Do you want me to cut it? Yeah, you can get out like if you want. I hope you don't want to call you Diana the whole time. I didn't know if I should be Debbie Diana.
Well, I guess to be consistent,
Yeah.
How do you want to, do you just want me to be here, or do you want to introduce me or something like that, or?
You want to introduce yourself? Just say, hi, I'm Matt so-and-so. I'm a present student of Jeff. Da-da-da-da. And is he fine in that chair?
Yeah, that's great.
And
yeah,
Jeff asked me to sit here and whatever he asked me to do. And just take it from there, and we'll take it till we have no battery.
All right. I really just have a couple questions.
Okay. Just wait for her. Okay, look, you're ready.
My name is Matthew Robinson, and I'm a current doctoral student here at Florida State. And I'm going to just sort of ask Dr. Jeffery a couple questions to try to get the graduate students' perspective and sort of to talk about the future. And basically, my first question is, what advice would you have for, not just for myself and for people who are here now, but for people who see this in the future, in terms of the frustration that we feel with criminology's lack of attention to biology and that sort of thing? A good example is, the whole social learning theory, like you mentioned before. Absolutely no attention paid to the brain. What advice could you give for someone like me and for people in the future in terms of what we should do to bring about change?
That's a very good question, and I suppose my own life of frustration is the answer.
Right.
If you're going to be a pioneer in this field, you're going to have to anticipate cutting some new paths and being on your own. The first thing I would try to do is make an alliance with people who are in urban planning, architecture, people who share your interest and who know more about that area than you do. I have always tried to line up with people who are in the other fields. I haven't been very successful at it, but that's just because in criminology you really don't get those kinds of opportunities. I'm not sure where we're headed in this field. I'm not sure how optimistic or pessimistic we have to be, but certainly somewhere along the line, crime prevention has to be looked at because we just can't continue building prisons.
Yes, several prominent researchers in the field have told me personally that they think that crime prevention is one of the 3 or 4 areas that every good program in criminology and criminal justice should have for the future. What do you feel about that?
Oh, I would buy that, of course.
And so that leads to the question of, suppose that one day people like myself go out in the field and we're chairing a department in criminology and we want to bring in the biology and we want to bring in the crime prevention. What kinds of practical things will we need to have there? What kinds of technological capabilities will we need to have and that sort of thing?
As an individual? Or as a
department?
As a department? Okay, you certainly should have somebody who is well versed in crime prevention, environmental design, that particular focus. And whether that involves people only in criminology or involves maybe aligning yourself with the urban planning people, depends on what are your resources. Or if you have the money and can convince somebody to hire an urban planner, that would be great. On the biological side, I think you at least would need a neuropsychiatrist and a biopsychologist to work with you.
Would that have to be in conjunction with like a medical school where they have pets?
It would be very helpful to have a medical school. One of the problems at Florida State is we do not have a medical school.
Right.
But there are a great many medical schools with great neurological clinics who are doing nothing in this area. So just having a medical school isn't the answer because we already have those.
So the answer is probably a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. There's no reason in Florida, for example, we have a medical school at Gainesville, we have one at Tampa, we have one at Miami, and these all have great neurological institutes. They're only 3, 4, 6 hours away. There's no reason why we couldn't have some kind of cooperative program with these other institutions.
Okay. My final question really deals with something you touched on about the future and about how here at Florida State we've had several students who've come out, who've worked underneath you specifically, who've done a lot of research in the environmental area. We've had people deal with convenience store robberies. We've had people deal with blue light trails and how those influence crime on campus.
Right.
We've had people deal with burglary at both the aggregate and individual level and the environmental characteristics associated with that. We've had crime around interstates now. It just came out in the last couple of years here at Florida State. And we have people here now working on the history of crime prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people here deal with biology. We have
That's right.
Denny Fishbein who did, and now we've got a new project here, a pilot project of some sort, dealing with trying to predict violent crime among juveniles and assessing the biological characteristics. Again, what kind of advice would you give to those of us who want to study biology but don't have the capabilities to do that because of where we are?
That's a hard one to answer. I think the bridge between biology and crime is a vast one, and I'm not sure how you can overcome it. What I would prefer, my own choice would be to come in as a criminologist and ally myself with a biologist, a psychobiological type, and use my knowledge as a criminologist and that person's knowledge as a biologist. I would never on my own do it. You know, I just don't have that kind of knowledge.
Yeah, and for those people who go on and just study the environment, I presume the advice you'd have would be to always put it in the framework of integrated systems.
I
always
would.
mention that you're not studying biology, but that is important.
That is right.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.